What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some thoughts on the Shadowrun Trilogy after reviewing the entire thing. So this video is kind of just filled with thoughts that I felt didn't really fit into any of the reviews individually, and kind of just wanted to talk about the series as a whole. So to kick us off, when I started looking into reviewing this game, one of the first things I did was a little bit of research, which is usually the case. Now, the Shadowrun series hasn't seen a full release since 2015 when Shadowrun Hong Kong was released, which of course was the last installment. And given the length between now and 2015, combined with the fact that you will hear very little in the negative sense when it comes to the Shadowrun Trilogy. Most people who play it are very happy with it. Which, of course, then brought me to the idea of, where's the next game? What's the holdup exactly? And that's where it gets a little bit complicated. So, while it isn't impossible that we'll never see another Shadowrun game, I think it's going to be a while at the very least, because the situation around ownership of the Shadowrun series is a little convoluted, frankly. And to the best of my knowledge, it is more or less as follows. Microsoft owns the IP, or the brand, if you will. However, there are several licenses in effect around its publishing. For instance, a company called Tops actually owns the rights to the tabletop RPG that the game is based on, and that's why they can publish things for it. And then it's my understanding that the people who made the video games, Harebrained Schemes, actually still has the license for making games for PC and mobile. Now, Microsoft, in theory, should still have the rights to make console games, but given Microsoft's sort of split console-PC market, the chance of them doing one without doing both is incredibly unlikely. And combine that with the fact that Harebrained Schemes was actually bought out by Paradox Interactive in 2018 and hasn't actually published anything since. And that brings us to where we are today, which is that a sequel is unlikely anytime soon. And without knowing the exact parameters of their licensing agreement, it's really hard to speculate any farther than that. But all I can say is it's not impossible, it's just not likely. Moving on to the more interesting stuff. Shadowrun is a series that gets better as you go. Now, ironically enough, it's called a trilogy, but the games themselves are pretty unrelated outside of their universe setting, which is why they're not called Shadowrun 1, 2, and 3, but rather Returns, Dragonfall, and Hong Kong. But the fact that they're called the trilogy can be a little misleading, as the games themselves aren't particularly connected in any way. Now, Shadowrun Returns is just a very short narrative adventure, really, more than anything else. It's very easy. There's not a lot of combat. All but the last two fights really have any sort of mechanics behind them. And as you'll often hear people say, Returns was more of a proof of concept than anything else. And it was kind of the base that they built the other bigger games on, Dragonfall and Hong Kong. Now, a lot of people will tell you one way or the other about Dragonfall or Hong Kong being better. I would tell you that gameplay-wise, Hong Kong definitely takes the cake. They made a lot of improvements. Everything flows smoother, but in terms of story and just what I want from a CRPG, definitely more so Dragonfall for me in that regard. But gameplay-wise, I do think Hong Kong plays better. But Hong Kong also sees you take on a, not exactly set protagonist, but a fairly set protagonist. You have a pretty dedicated background associated with your character that you have to work around if you want to roleplay. Whereas Dragonfall and Returns even are much more open than that. But outside of more subjective things, like just which one I enjoyed more, frankly, you really do see the improvements that get made to each title as you go along. So Dragonfall is an improvement from Returns in almost every single way, as I mentioned in, I believe, an Impressions video. It's actually very impressive considering that Dragonfall wasn't kickstarted, actually. Returns and Hong Kong were kickstarted. Dragonfall was originally released as a standalone module for the Returns framework. So if you're unaware, each of these games has a sort of module system. They all released with an editor that allowed players to make their own adventures and campaigns. There's a few well-known ones, actually. But when you're playing the campaigns of these games, all you're really playing is a module that when you hit new game, you select. And if you have any of the other modules downloaded, you can just play them instead. And Dragonfall released as one of those modules, but then saw a more in-depth standalone release about 6 months later. And given that nature, I think it's honestly incredible just how much they improved Dragonfall from the original Returns. Hong Kong, of course, saw less improvements overall, but nonetheless important improvements. Cyberware got a really big update, as well as the Decking's Matrix system, which is another thing I want to talk about. One thing that never really landed for me across this entire series was the decking. So in this world, hacking has been replaced with decking, which is basically the same thing, but decking is a more relevant term to the way it's done in the future. With someone bringing their deck, which is what they hack with, and which is why they're called deckers, to upload their consciousness into this sort of 3D realm of the internet called the Matrix. And while you're in the Matrix, you kind of leave your physical body behind you. And just across the series, I did not enjoy this. So in the first and second game, it's largely a turn-based endeavor. Dragonfall has more mechanics and more programs and things for your decker to use. And then Hong Kong sort of added this real-time element where you can kind of stealth your way through, which wasn't possible in the first two. But rather you could avoid sentries and things and then hack your way past barriers. And while I would say Hong Kong has the best iteration of this system, this is a system that just failed to land for me in every single game. It's just odd. I don't know offhand what I could really suggest for them to make it better for me personally. And I'm not even saying it's unenjoyable, it's just not something I cared for. But the concept of decking is pretty integral to the Shadowrun series, so as you might imagine, having a decker with you is pretty important across all three games. But in order for a decker to be effective, you have to get them to jack in, as they call it, to the Matrix, which takes them out of the fight you are in and puts them in a separate combat arena, so to speak, which they get to deal with while you're in combat. Now, in Dragonfall, 3 rounds in the Matrix equals 1 round outside of the Matrix, so combat would take place in both places, whereas in Hong Kong, you pretty much deal with the Matrix only, and then you circle back to the actual combat, which is largely helped along by the stealth system that they implemented. But the idea being that you'll explore the Matrix, find data nodes and control centers to turn, the mechanical and electronic devices in the real world that you need access to on or off, etc. But if your character dies in the Matrix, their character in real life just actually dies because that is their conscience. But while you're in there, you'll use all sorts of programs and things to attack other programs, and I don't know, the whole thing just didn't land for me personally. And I wouldn't even go so far as to say that it's a bad system, because I don't think that it is bad, I just didn't like it. And it's so integral to what the Shadowrun universe is that it kind of needs to be here, but at the same time, the only way that I could make it better for me would make it significantly less interesting overall, which is why it's hard to suggest anything else, basically. But across the board, the trilogy is just very good, and it was really cool to see it improve so much as you go along, even with the smaller tweaks and changes here and there. But overall, if you have any reservations about checking out this trilogy, I really would recommend it. It's honestly very good, and it actually kind of rode that wave of CRPGs that kind of revived the genre into the sort of CRPG renaissance we find ourselves in here lately. And if nothing else, this trilogy really deserves a lot of credit for that as well, because things like this level editor, that matrix system, they really did try a lot of fun stuff that honestly I don't know other CRPGs of today would have tried if these games hadn't done it earlier. But there you go, guys. I don't want to ramble on forever and ever here, so there's my thoughts kind of on the trilogy as a whole. Surprisingly good. I'm very glad I finally got around to playing it, so thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.